Chat, hi! Welcome! Hi! Moo Moo and Lice. Hi! Hi, hi. Tonight I am going to be starting a book with chat. Yes, I have a temporary potion right now that turns me into an elf from the plant. It's not a full cure because I'm a little wonky. This isn't my true elf form, but we're working on it. But yeah, also hi Roman. Okay, I've turned off a lot of my redeems tonight. For reading streams, I don't want a lot of redeems going off because I'm going to have a VOD of me reading bedtime stories that I pick with chat that are public domain. Just cause it's really fun. And it's an easy VOD. I won't get copyrighted for that. I don't. Hi, Kara Swimming. Thank you, thank you. I don't think I can read the Nutcracker. Okay. But yeah, I hope the Christmas vibes in the background aren't too loud or too quiet. I hope they're just right. But yeah, 3D models have a lot of soul. Oh, thank you. Yeah. This one is a Roid, so it's kind of like, it's not like a Blender one, but you know. Hello. So yeah. Yes. So I'm gonna be starting the Nutcracker. As you can little ASMR my book. I have really hot tea. I just burnt my tongue. So the gingerbread? Yeah, the gingerbread. Okay. Oh, I need some light. There we go. I'm gonna bring my mic a little closer. Oh, you might take my headset off too, huh? There we go. We are going to be reading the Nutcracker, and if anybody asks chat, you type at them Nutcracker while I'm reading, okay? But yeah. The Nutcracker, which shows how the author was forced to relate the history of the Nutcracker of Nuremberg. There is a juvenile party at the house of my friend, Lord M, and I'd helped add to the number and the noise of company by taking my little daughter. It is true that in half an hour, during which I joined in 4 or 5 games of Blind Man's Bluff, another game, and the Hunt the Slipper, in spite of the noise which was made by a couple of dozen delightful little rogues from 8 to 10 years old, and who seemed to try which would talk the loudest, I slipped away out of the drawing room and sought a certain snug parlor which I knew and where I hoped to enjoy a little peace for an hour. I had effected my retreat with as much skill as success, escaping not only without being perceived by the juvenile guests, which was not very difficult considering how intent they were upon their games, but also unnoticed by their parents, which was not so easy a matter. I had reached the wished-out parlor when I observed, on entering it, that it was for a moment converted into a supper room. The sideboards being heaped up with confectionery and other refreshments, now as these appearances seemed to be promise that I should not be disturbed until supper time. I threw myself into a comfortable armchair, quite delighted, with the idea that I was about to enjoy an hour's peace after the dreadful noise which had deafened me in the drawing room. I don't know exactly how it was, but in the end, at about 10 minutes I fell fast asleep. I cannot say how long I had thus lost all knowledge of what was passing around, when I suddenly arose by the loud peals of laughter. I opened my eyes in terror and saw nothing but the beautifully painted ceiling over my head. Then I tried to get up, but the attempt was useless, for I was fastened to my chair as firmly as the Gulliver was on the shore of Lilliput. Lilliput? Lilliput. Lilliput. I immediately understood in what a scrape I had gotten myself. I had been surprised in the enemy's country, and was a prisoner of war. I immediately understood. The best thing for me to do in such a case was to put a good face upon the matter and entreat for my liberty. My first proposal was to take my conquerors the very next morning to Pharis's and treat them to anything they liked, but unhappily the moment was not well chosen for such an offer. Offer? I was addressing myself to an audience already well stuffed with tarts, and whose hands were filled with patties. My proposal was therefore refused in plain terms. I then offered to take the entire party to Vauxhall next evening, and amuse them with the exhibition of fireworks. The proposal was well received by the little boys, but the little girls would not listen to it, because they were dreadfully afraid of fireworks. They could not endure the noise of the crackers, and the smell of gunpowder annoyed them. I was about to make my third offer when I heard a sweet little musical note whispering in the ears of a companion certain words which made me tremble. Ask Papa, who writes novels, to tell us some pretty story. I was on the point of protesting against this, but my voice was drowned by the cries of, "Oh yes, a story, we will have a story." "But my dear children," I said as loud as I could, "you ask me the most difficult thing in the world." My cat's being a cat. A story indeed. Ask me to recite one of my Gay's fables, or my name is Norval, if you will, and I may consent, but a story. "We don't want anything out of the speaker," cried the children all together. "We want a story." My dear little friends, if there is no if in the cause, we will have a story. But my dear little friends, I say again, there is no but, we will have a story. Yes, we'll have a story, we'll have a story, now echoed all the sides, and in a manner which was too positive to object to any longer. "Well," I said with a sigh, "if you must, you must." "Ah, the capital!" cried my little tormentors. "That's the capital. But I must tell you one thing," said I. "The story I am about to relate is not my own." "Never mind that, as long as it amuses us." I must confess that I was a little vexed to think that my audience was so light a value upon my own writings. "Whose tale is it then, sir?" asked a pretty voice belonging no doubt to some little being more curious than the others. "It is by Hoffman, miss." "Have you ever heard of Hoffman?" "No, sir, I've never heard of him." "And what is the name of your story, sir?" asked a young gentleman, who, being the son of the nobleman that gave the party, felt a right to question me. "The History of a Nutcracker," was my answer. "Does the title please you, my dear Henry?" "I don't think the title promises anything particularly fine, but never mind, go on. If it does not please us, we will stop you, and you must begin another, and so on, I can tell you, until you're ready to fix upon a good one." "One moment," I exclaimed. "I will not accept these conditions. If you were grown-up persons, well and good. Nevertheless, those are our conditions. If not, prisoner, you must remain with us forever. My dear Henry, you are a charming boy, well brought up, and I shall be much surprised if you do not some day become Prime Minister of England. Let me go free, and I will do as you ask." Some good tea. "On my word of honor?" "On my word of honor." At the same moment I felt the 1,000 threads that held me suddenly become loose. Each of the little tormentors had set to work to untie a knot, and in half a minute I was at liberty. Now, as everyone must keep his word, even when it is pledged to children, I desire my audience to sit around me, and when the children had all placed themselves in a manner so comfortable that I fancied they would soon fall off to sleep in their chairs, I began my story in the following manner. Once upon a time, there lived at Nuremberg, in Germany, a judge of great respectability, and who was called Judge Silberhaus, which means Silver House. The judge had a son and a daughter. The son was 9 years old and was named Fritz. The daughter was 7.5 and was called Mary. The two beautiful children, but so different in disposition and features that no one would have believed them to be brother and sister. Fritz was a stout boy with ruddy cheeks and roguish looks. He was very impatient and stamped on the floor whenever he was contradicted, for he thought that everything in the world must have been made for his amusement or to suit his fancy. In this humor he would remain until the judge, annoyed by his cries and screams or by the stamping, came out of his study and, raising a forefinger, said with a frown, "Master Fritz." Those 2 words were quite sufficient to make Master Fritz wish that the world would open up and swallow him up. As for his mother, it was no matter how much or how often she raised her forefinger, for Fritz did not mind her at all. His sister Mary was, on the contrary, a delicate and pale child, with long hair curling naturally and flowing over her little white shoulders, like a flood of golden light upon a vase of alabaster. She was sweet, amiable, bashful, and kind to all who were in sorrow. Even to her dolls, she was very obedient to her mamma, and never contradicted her governess, Miss Trudchen, so that Mary was beloved by everyone. Now, another sip of tea, please. The 24th of December 17th had arrived. You all know, my dear young friends, that the 24th of December is called Christmas Eve, being born the day before the one which the Redeemer Jesus was born. But I must now explain something to you. You have all heard, perhaps, that every country has its peculiar customs, and the best read amongst you are aware that Nuremberg in Germany is a town famous for its toys, puppets, and playthings, of which it exports great quantities to other countries. You will admit, therefore, that the little boys and girls of Nuremberg ought to be the happiest children in the world, unless indeed they are like the inhabitants of Ostend, which seem only to delight in their oysters for the purpose of sending them to foreign markets. Germany, being quite a different country from England, has altogether other customs. In England, New Year's Day is a grand day for making presents, so that many parents would be very glad if the year always commenced with the 2nd of January. But in Germany, the great day for presents is the 24th of December. The one preceding Christmas Day. Moreover, in Germany, children's presents are given in a peculiar way. A large shrub is placed upon a table in the drawing room, and to all its branches are hung the toys to be distributed among the children. Such playthings that are too heavy to hang in the shrub are placed on the table, and the children are then told that it is their guardian angel who sends them all those pretty toys. This is a very innocent deception after all, and perhaps it can scarcely be called a deception, because all the good things of this world are sent to us by heaven. I need scarcely tell you that among those children of Nuremberg who received most presents were the son and daughter of Judge Silberhaus, for besides their father and mother who doted on them, they also had a good godfather who loved them dearly, and whose name was Drosselmeyer. I must describe in a few words the portrait of this illustrious person who occupied in the town of Nuremberg a position almost as high as the Judge Silberhaus himself. More tea, please. Yes, we're reading the original Nutcracker by Alexandre Dumas. He wrote The Count of Monte Cristo. Okay, that's on the reading list. Godfather Drosselmeyer, who was a great physician and doctor of medicine, was by no means a very good-looking person. He was a tall, thin man, about 6 feet high, but who stooped very much so that in spite of the length of his legs, he can almost pick up his handkerchief if it fell over without stooping any lower. So he was a tall man, but he was kind of hunched. His face was wrinkled as a golden rennet that had withered and fallen from a tree. Being blind in the right eye, he wore a black eye patch, and being bald entirely, he wore a shining and frizzled wig, which he had made himself with spun glass, such as you may have seen from the glass blowers spin at the Adelaide Gallery or Polytechnic Institution. That's a location name. However compelled, for fear of damaging this ingenious contrivance, to carry his hat under his arm. His remaining eye was sparkling. And my cat is in the wrong spot on my desk. That young lady before you say something. Okay. Now where were we? Oh, and seemed not only to perform its own duty, but that of its absent companion, so rapidly did not glance around any room with which Godfather Drosselmeyer was desirous to scrutinize, and all points are fixed upon any person whose secret thoughts he wished to read. Now Godfather Drosselmeyer, who was a learned doctor, did not follow the example of those physicians who allowed their patients to die, but occupied his time in giving life to dead things. I mean that, by studying the formation of men and animals, he had gained so deep a knowledge of the manner in which they were made that he was able to manufacture men who could walk, bow to each other, and go through their exercises with a musket. He also made ladies who danced and played upon the harpsichord and the harp and the viola, dogs that ran, carried, and barked, birds that flew, hopped, and sang, and fish that swam and ate crumbs of bread. He'd even succeeded in making puppets and images of Punch utter a few words. Not many, it is true, but such as Papa, Mama, and etc. The tones were certainly harsh, always, and always the same in sound, but because you can very well understand that all this was done merely by the means of machinery concealed inside the toys, and no machinery can ever perform the same wonders as the beings which God had created. Nevertheless, in spite of all difficulties, Godfather Drosselmeyer did not despair of being someday able to make real men, real women, real dogs, real birds, real fish. It is scarcely necessary to add that his two godchildren, to whom he had promised the first proofs of his success in this line, awaited the happy moment with great patience. Godfather Drosselmeyer had reached this state of perfection in mechanical science, was a most useful man to his friends. Thus, for instance, if a timepiece at the house of Judge Silberhaus got out of order, in spite of the attentions of the usual clockmakers, if the hand suddenly stopped, if the tick-tick seemed to go badly, or if the wheels inside would not move, Godfather Drosselmeyer was immediately sent for, and had hastened to the house as quick as he could, for he was a man devoted to the art of mechanics. He was no sooner shown the poor clock than he instantly opened it, took out the works, and placed them between his knees. Then, with his eye glittering like a carbuncle and his wig laid upon the floor, he drew from a pocket a number of little tools, which he had made himself, and the proper use of which he knew alone. Choosing the most pointed one, he plunged it into the very midst of the works, to the great alarm of little Mary, who could not believe that the poor clock did not suffer from the operation. But in a short time, when the old gentleman had touched the works in various parts, and placed them again in their case, or on the stand, or in between the four pillars of the timepiece, as the case might be, the clock soon began to revive, to tick as loud as ever, and to strike with its shrill, clear voice at the proper time. A circumstance that gave new life, as if it were, to the room itself, which without it seemed a melancholy place. Moreover, in compliance with the wishes of little Mary, who was grieved to see the kitchen dog turning the spit, Godfather Drosselmeyer made a wooden dog which, by means of mechanism connected inside, turned the spit without annoyance to itself. Turk, who had done this duty for 3 years until he had become quite shaky all over, was now able to lie down in peace in front of the kitchen fire and amuse himself by watching the movements of his successor. Thus, after the judge's wife, after Fritz, and after Mary, the dog Turk was certainly the next inmate of the house who had most reason to love and respect Godfather Drosselmeyer. Turk was indeed grateful, and showed his joy whenever Drosselmeyer drew near the house, by leaping up against the front door and wagging his tail, even before the old gentleman had knocked. On the evening of the 24th of December, just as the light was approaching, Fritz and Mary had not been allowed to enter the drawing-room all day, were huddled together in a corner of a dining parlor. Miss Trudchen, the governess, was knitting near the window, to which she had moved her chair in order to catch the last rays of daylight. The children were seized with a kind of vague fear, because candles had not been brought into the room, according to custom, so they were talking in a low tone to each other, just as children talk when they're afraid. "Fritz," Mary said Mary, "I'm sure Papa and Mama are busy preparing the Christmas tree, for ever since the morning I'd heard a great deal going on in the drawing-room, which we were forbidden to enter." And I know," said Fritz. "By the way, Turk barked 10 minutes ago that Godfather Drosselmeyer has arrived." "Oh, I'd wondered what our kind dear godfather had brought us," exclaimed Mary, clapping her little hands. "I'm sure it was a beautiful garden planted with trees, and with a beautiful river running between the banks covering the flowers, and on the river too there were silver swans with collars of gold, and a little girl will bring them sweet cake, which they will eat out of her apron." "Ah, Jam, thank you for the raid. I hope you're doing well. I'm reading the Nutcracker. Yeah, thank you. I hope you all had a good stream, and good night." Let's see. "In the first place, miss," said Fritz, with the authoritative tone which was natural to him, and which his parents considered to be one of his greatest faults, "you must know that swans do not eat sweet cake." "I thought they did," answered Mary, "but as you are a year and a half older than I, you must know best." Fritz tossed his head up in the air with an air of importance, "And for my part," he continued, "I feel certain that if Godfather Drosselmeyer brings anything at all, it'll be a castle with soldiers to watch it and enemies to attack it. We shall then have a most famous battle." "I don't like battles," said Mary. "If he does bring a castle as you think he will, it must be for you. I shall, however, take care of the wounded." "Whatever he brings," returned Fritz, "you know very well that it is neither for you nor me, because the toys which Godfather Drosselmeyer gives us are always taken away again immediately afterwards, under pretense that they really are works of great art. Then you know they are always put into that great cupboard with the glass doors, and on the top shelves, which Papa himself can only reach when he stands upon a chair. So after all, I much prefer the toys which Papa and Mama give us, which we are allowed to play with until we break them into 1,000 pieces." "And so do I," answered Mary, "only we must not say so to Godfather." "And why not?" "Because he would feel annoyed to think that we do not like his toys as much as those which Papa and Mama give us. He gives them to us thinking to please us, and it would be wrong to tell him the contrary." "Oh, nonsense!" called Fritz. "Miss Mary is quite right, Master Fritz," said Dame Trudchen, who was generally very silent and only spoke on important occasions. Come, said Mary hastily, in order to prevent Fritz from giving an impudent answer to the poor governess. Let us guess what our parents intend to give us. For my part, I told Mamma, but upon condition that she would not scold, that Miss Rose, my doll, grows more and more awkward in spite of the lessons which I'm constantly giving her, and that she does nothing but fall upon her nose, which never fails to leave the most disagreeable marks upon her face, so that I can no longer take her into decent society, because her face does not at all correspond with her frocks. And I, said Fritz, did not hesitate to answer Papa that a nice little horse would look admirably well in my stables. I also took the opportunity to inform him that no army could possibly exist without cavalry, and that I wanted a squadron of them to complete the division which I command. These words made Trudchen conclude that the moment was favorable for her to speak a second time. Master Fritz and Miss Mary, she said, you know very well that it is your guardian angel who sends you and blesses all those fine toys which you are given. Do not therefore say beforehand what you want, because the angel knows much better than you what will please you. Oh. Did they just say the girl is ugly? Basically, she says that she's been dropping her doll a lot, and her doll is getting kind of scuffed. It must be, some sort of porcelain or something. Oh, cried Fritz, and yet last year he sent me foot soldiers, although I had just said I should have been better satisfied with a squadron of cavalry. For my part, I have only to thank my good angel, said Mary, for I did ask for a doll last year, and not only had the doll, but also a beautiful white dove with red feet and a beak. In the meantime, the night had altogether drawn in, and the children who were by degrees spoke lower and lower and grew closer and closer together, fancied that they heard the wings of their guardian angels fluttering near them, and a sweet music in the distance, like that of an organ accompanying the hymn of the Nativity beneath the glowing arches of a cathedral. Presenting a sudden light shone upon the wall for a moment, and Fritz and Mary believed that it was their guardian angel who, after depositing the toys in the drawing room, flew away in the midst of a golden luster to visit other children who were expecting him with the same impatience as themselves. Immediately afterwards, a bell rang, the door was thrown violently open, and so strong a light burst into the apartment that the children were dazzled and uttered cries of surprise and alarm. The judge and his wife then appeared at the door and took the hands of their children, saying, "Come, little dears, and see what the guardian angels have sent you." The children hastened to the drawing room, and Miss Trudchen had placed her work upon a chair, followed them. And that is the end of chapter 1. Again, thank you for the read and welcome for having cozy story time. The Christmas tree. My dear children, you all know the beautiful toy stalls, the Soho Bazaar, the Pantheon, the Lowthrow Arcade, and your parents had often taken you there to permit you to choose whatever you liked best. Then you have stopped short, with longing eyes and open mouth, and you have experienced a pleasure which you will never know in your lives. No, not even when you become men and acquire titles or fortunes. Well, the same joy was felt by Fritz and Mary when they entered the drawing room and saw the great tree growing, as it were, from the middle of the table, covered with blossoms, made of sugar and sugar plums instead of fruit, the whole glittering by the light of 100 Christmas candles concealed amidst the leaves. Ah, thank you for the read. Welcome. We're doing story time. I'm reading The Nutcracker by Alexandre Dumas. Yeah, welcome. I hope you had a good time and good night. At the beautiful sight, Fritz leapt for joy and danced about in a manner which showed how well he had attended to the lessons of his dancing master. On her side, Mary could not restrain two large tears of joy which the liquid pearls rolled down her countenance with, that was opened and smiling as a rose in June. But the children's joy knew no bounds when they came to examine all the pretty things which were covered on the table. There was a beautiful doll, twice as large as Miss Rose, and there was a charming silk frock, hung on a stand in such a manner that Mary could walk around it. Fritz was also well pleased, for he found upon the table a squadron of cavalry, with red jackets and gold lace and mounted on white horses, while on the carpet near the table stood a famous horse which he also much longed to see in his stables, and the moment did this modern Alexander leap upon the back of that brilliant horse which was already saddled and bridled, and having ridden 2 or 3 times around the table, he got off again, declaring that though the animal was very spirited and restive, he should have soon been able to tame him in such a manner that ere a month passed the horse, which would be quiet as a lamb. But at that moment, when Fritz set his foot upon the ground, when Mary was baptizing her new doll by the name of Clara, the bell rang a second time, and the children turned towards that corner of the room when the sound came. They then beheld something which had hitherto escaped their attention, so intent had they been upon the beautiful Christmas tree. In fact, the corner of the room of which I have just spoken was concealed or cut off, as if it were by a large Chinese screen, behind which there was a certain noise accompanied by certain sweet music, which proved that something unusual was going on in that quarter. The children then recollected they had not seen the doctor, and they both exclaimed at the same moment, "Oh, Godpapa Drosselmeyer!" At those words, as if it had only waited for the exclamation to put itself into motion, the screen opened inwards and showed not only Father Drosselmeyer, but something more. In the midst of the green meadow, decorated with flowers, stood a magnificent country seat, with numerous windows all made of real glass in front, and 2 gilt towers of wings. At the same moment, the jingling of bells was heard from within. The doors and windows opened, and the rooms inside were discovered, lighted up by wax tapers half an inch high. In those rooms were several little gentlemen and ladies all walking about. The gentlemen splendidly dressed in lace coats and silk waistcoats and breeches, each with a sword by their side and hat under their arms. The ladies gorgeously attired in brocades, their hair dressed in the style of the 18th century, and each one holding a fan in her hand, wherewithin they all fanned themselves as if overcome by heat. In the central drawing room, which actually seemed to be on fire, so splendid was the lustre of the crystal chandelier filled with wax candles, a number of children were dancing to the jingling music, the boys all in round jackets, the girls all in short frocks. At the same time, a gentleman clad in a furred coat appeared at the window of the adjoining chamber, made signs, and then disappeared again, while Godfather Drosselmeyer himself was with his drab frock coat, the eye patch of his eye, and the glass wig, so like the original, although only 3 inches high, that the puppet might have been taken for the doctor, as if seen at a great distance, went out in front of the door of the mansion, with the air of a gentleman, inviting those who were walking outside to enter his abode. So basically, their godfather is a toy maker. Yes, he's like around, so he makes toys for them every year. So he's made this whole display, and he put himself in it. Easter egg. Yeah. So that paragraph was describing. This is a little bit of an older text, so as I read stuff that might seem confusing, I'll explain it to chat so you can get insight. Oh, I'm gonna drink some tea. Yeah, no problem. The first moment was one of surprise and delight for the two children, but having watched the building for a few minutes with his elbows resting on the table, Fritz rose and exclaimed, "But Godpapa Drosselmeyer, why do you keep going out and coming back in the same door? You must be tired of going backwards and forwards like that. Come enter by that door, come out by this one here." And Fritz pointed with his finger to the doors of the two towers. "No, that cannot be done," answered Godfather Drosselmeyer. "Well then," Fritz said, "do me the pleasure of going up the stairs and taking the place of that gentleman at the window, and tell him to go down to the door." "It's impossible, my dear Fritz," again said the doctor. "At all events, the children have danced enough. Let them go and walk, while the gentlemen and ladies who are now walking dance in their turn." "But you are not reasonable, you little rogue," cried the godpapa, who began to grow angry. "The mechanism must move in a certain way." "Then let them go into the house," said Fritz. "Now you are silly, my dear boy," observed the judge. "You see, that is impossible for you to enter the house, since the vanes of the top of the tower scarcely come up to your shoulders." Fritz yielded to this reasoning and held his tongue, but in a few moments, seeing that the ladies and gentlemen kept on walking, and the children would never leave off dancing, that a gentleman with a furred coat appeared and disappeared at regular intervals, and that Godfather Drosselmeyer did not leave the door, he again broke the silence. "My dear godpapa," he said, "if all these little figures can do nothing more than what they are doing over and over again, you may take them away tomorrow, for I do not care about them, and I like my horse much better, because it runs when I choose, and my cavaliers because they move at my command, and wheel to the right or left, or march forward and backwards, and are not shut up in any house, like you little poor people, who can only move over and over in the same way." "Savage! You say your toys are boring, old man." "Old man, your toys stink." As an adult, I can appreciate a toy well made. With these words, he turned his back upon Godfather Drosselmeyer, and the horse hastened to the table and drew up his cavalry in battle array. As for Mary, she slipped away very gently, because the motions of the little figures in the house seemed to be very tiresome. But as she was a charming child, she said nothing for fear of wounding the feelings of Godfather Drosselmeyer. Indeed, the moment Fritz turned his back, the doctor said to the judge and his wife in a tone of vexation, "This masterpiece is not fit for children. Now put my horse back again into the box and take it away." But the judge's wife approached him, and in order to atone for his son's rudeness, begged Godfather Drosselmeyer to explain all the secrets of the beautiful house, and praised the ingenuity of the mechanism, to such an extent that she not only made the doctor forget his vexation, but put him into such good humor that he drew from the pockets of his drab coat a number of little men and women with horn complexions, white eyes, gilt hands and feet. Besides the beauty of their appearance, these little men and women set forth a delicious perfume because they were made of cinnamon. Okay. At this moment, Miss Trudchen called Mary and offered her to help her pick out a pretty little silk frock, which she had so much admired on the first entering the drawing room. But Mary, in spite of her unusual politeness, did not answer the governess so much. She was occupied with a new personage whom she had discovered amongst the toys, and to whom, my dear children, I must briefly direct your attention, since he is actually the hero of my tale, and which Miss Trudchen, Mary Fritz the judge's lady, and even Godfather Drosselmeyer are only secondary characters. We're getting closer to the main part. The little man with the wooden cloak. I wonder who that could be. Okay. doing pretty good on time. I told you that. Mary did not reply to the invitation of Miss Trudgeon because she had just discovered a new toy, which she had not before perceived. Indeed, by dint of making his horses march and countermarch about the table, cavalry, Fritz had brought to light a charming little gentleman who, leaning in a melancholy mood against the trunk of the Christmas tree, awaited in silence and polite reserve the moment when his turn to be inspected should arrive. We must pause to notice the appearance of this little man, to whom I gave the epithet charming somewhat hastily, for, in addition to his body being too long and large for the miserable little thin legs which supported it, his head was the size so enormous that it was quite a variance with the proportions indicated not only by nature but also by those drawing masters who know so much better than even nature herself. But if there were any fault in this person, that defect was atoned for by the excellence of his toilette, which denoted at once a man of education and taste. He wore a braided frock coat of violet-colored velvet, all frogged and covered with buttons, trousers of the same material, and the most charming little Wellington boots ever seen on his feet of a student or an officer. But these were two circumstances which seemed strange in respect to a man who perceived such elegant taste. The one who was an ugly narrow cloak made of wood, which hung down like a pig's tail from the nape of the neck to the middle of his back. The other was a wretched cap, such as peasants sometimes wear in Switzerland, upon his head. Mary, when she perceived those two objects, which seemed so unsuitable to the rest of the costume, remembered that Godfather Drosselmeyer himself wore above his drab coat a little collar of no better appearance than the wooden cloak belonging to the little gentleman in the military frock. The doctor had often covered his own bald head with an ugly and absolutely frightful cap, unlike all the other ugly caps in the world. Although this circumstance did not prevent the doctor from being an excellent godpapa, she even thought to herself that were Godpapa Drosselmeyer to imitate altogether the dress of this little gentleman with the wooden cloak, he could not possibly become so genteel and interesting as the puppet. You can very well believe that these reflections on the part of Mary were not made without a close inspection of the little man, whom she liked the very first moment that she saw him. Then the more she looked at him, the more she was struck by the sweetness and amiability which were expressed by his countenance. His clear green eyes, which were certainly rather goggle, beamed with serenity and kindness. The frizzled beard of white cotton extending beneath his chin seemed to become amazingly, because it set off the charming smile of his mouth, which was rather wide perhaps, but then the lips were as red as vermilion. Thus was it that, after examining the little man of upwards for 10 minutes, without daring too much to touch it, Mary exclaimed, "Oh dear papa, who is that funny figure leaning against a Christmas tree?" "It belongs to no one in particular," answered the judge, "but to both of you together." "How do you mean, dear papa? I do not understand you." "This little man," continued the judge, "will help you both, for it is he who in the future will crack the nuts for you. He belongs as much to Fritz as to you, and as much to you as to Fritz." Thus speaking, the judge took up the little man, very carefully raising his wooden cloak, made open his mouth by a very simple motion, and displayed 2 rows of sharp white teeth. Mary then placed a nut in the little man's mouth, and crack, crack, the shell was broken into a dozen pieces, and the kernel fell whole and sound to Mary's hand. Yep, that's a Nutcracker. The little girl then learned that dandified gentleman belonged to that ancient and respectable race of nutcrackers whose origin is as ancient as that of the town of Nuremberg, and that he continued to exercise the honorable calling of his forefathers. Mary, delighted to have made this discovery, leapt with joy, whereas the judge said, "Well, my dear little Mary, since the nutcracker pleases you so much, although it belongs equally to Fritz and yourself, it is to you that I especially trust it. I place it in your care." With these words, the judge handed the little fellow to Mary, who took the puppet in her arms and began to practice it in its vocation, choosing, however, so good was her heart, the smallest of nuts, that it might not be compelled to open its mouth too wide. By doing so, its face assumed a most ridiculous expression. Then Miss Trudgeon drew near to behold the little puppet in her turn, and for her also did it perform its duty in the most assuming and obliging manner in the world, although she was but a dependent. While he was employed in training his horses and parading around his cavalier, Master Fritz heard the crack, crack, so often repeated that he felt sure something new was going on. He accordingly looked up and turned his head, his large inquiring eyes upon the group, composed of the judge, Mary, and Miss Trudgeon, and when he observed the little man with the little wooden cloak in his sister's arms, he leapt from his horse, and without waiting to put the animal in the stable, hastened towards Mary. Then what a joyous shout of laughter burst from his lips as he espied the funny appearance of the little man opening his large mouth. Fritz also demanded his share of nuts, which the puppet cracked, and this was, of course, granted. Next, he wanted to hold the little man while he cracked the nuts, and this wish was also gratified, only, in spite of the remonstrance of his sister, Fritz chose the largest and hardest nuts to cram into his mouth, so that by the fifth or sixth crack, out fell 3 of the poor little fellow's teeth. At the same time, his chin fell and became tremulous of that of an old man. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker," said Mary, snatching the little man from the hands of Fritz. "What a stupid fellow he is," cried the boy. "He pretends to be a nutcracker, and his jaws are just as brittle as glass. He is a false nutcracker, and he does not understand his duty. Give him to me, Mary. I will make him go on cracking nuts, but even if he loses all his teeth in doing so, and his chin is dislocated entirely, but how you seem to feel for the lazy fellow." "No, no, no," cried Mary, clasping the little man in her arms. "No, you should not have my nutcracker. See how he looks at me, as much as to tell me that his poor jaws hurt. Fie, Fritz, you're very ill-natured. You beat your horses, and the other day you shot one of your soldiers." Yeah, so he immediately just... So the brother is not a good person, and the sister's like an angel. Yeah, that's pretty much how this is going. "I beat my horses when they are restive," said Fritz with an air of importance. "And as for the soldier whom I shot the other day, he was a wretched scoundrel that I've never been able to do anything with for the last year, who deserted one fine morning with his arms and baggage, and a crime most punishable by death in all countries. Besides, all these things are matters of discipline, which do not regard women." Okay, this book was written a long time ago. "I do not prevent you from boxing your doll's ears, so do not try to hinder me with whipping my horses or shooting my soldiers. But I want the nutcracker. Papa, Papa, help me, help!" cried Mary, wrapping the little man in her pocket handkerchief. "Help! Fritz is going to take the nutcracker from me." At Mary's cries, not only the judge drew near the children, but his wife and godfather Drosselmeyer also ran towards them. The 2 children told their stories in their own way, Mary wishing to keep the nutcracker and Fritz anxious to have it again. But to the astonishment of Godfather Drosselmeyer with a smile that seemed perfectly frightful to the poor girl, decided in favor of Fritz. Happily for the poor nutcracker, the judge and his wife took little Mary's part. "My dear Fritz," said the judge, I trusted the Nutcracker to the care of your sister, and as far as my knowledge of surgery goes, I see that poor creature is unwell and requires attention. I therefore give him over solely to the care of Mary until he is quite well. And no one must say a word against my decision, and you, Fritz, who stand up so firmly in behalf of military discipline, when did you ever hear of making a wounded soldier return to his duty? The wounded always go to the hospital until they are cured, and if they be disabled by their wounds, they are entitled to pensions. Their dad's a judge. He's hitting him with the law. He said, I work with the law, kids. Fritz was about to reply, but the judge raised his finger to level with his right eye and said, Master Fritz, you have only seen what influence those 2 words had upon the boy. Thus ashamed at him having drawn upon himself the reprimand conveyed in those words, he slipped quietly off, without giving the answer, to the table where the horses were posted. Then, having placed the sentinels in their stations, he marched off, the rest to their quarters for the night. In the meantime, Mary picked up the 3 little teeth which had fallen from the Nutcracker's mouth and kept them. Nutcracker wrapped well herself up in the pocket handkerchief. She had also bound up his chin with a pretty white ribbon, which she cut from the frock. On his side, the little man, who was at first very pale, much frightened, seemed quite content in the care of his protectress, gradually acquired confidence, which he felt himself gently rocked in her arms. Then Mary perceived that Godfather Drosselmeyer watched with mocking smiles the care which she bestowed upon the little man with the wooden cloak, and it struck her that the single eye of the doctor had acquired an expression of spite and malignity which she had never seen before. She therefore tried to get away from him, but Godfather Drosselmeyer burst out laughing, saying, Well, my dear goddaughter, I really am astonished that a pretty girl like you would be so devoted to an ugly little urchin like that. Mary turned round, and much as she loved her godfather, even the compliment which he had paid her did not make amends for the unjust attack he had made upon the person of her Nutcracker. She even felt, contrary to her usual disposition, very angry at that vague comparison which she had been before formed between the little man with the wooden cloak and her godfather returned to her memory. Godpapa Drosselmeyer, she said, you are unkind towards my little Nutcracker, whom you call an ugly urchin. Who knows whether you would even look so well as he, even if you had this pretty little military coat, his pretty little breeches, and his pretty little boots. At these words, Mary's parents burst out laughing, and the doctor's nose grew proceedingly longer. Why did the doctor's nose grow so much longer? Mary, surprised by the effect of her remark, could not have guessed the reason. But there are never any effects without causes. That reason, no doubt, belonged to some strange, unknown cause, which we must explain. Wonderful events. You're here to sleep? Welcome, welcome, welcome. We've gone through, I think, 3 chapters, around the 4th. We're on page 27 of 142. We're not even halfway through the book yet. I love these books so much. I like reading classics. I am gonna return the message. It's been good so far, thank you. Wonderful events. I do not know, my dear little friends, whether you remember that I spoke of a certain large cupboard with glass windows in which children's toys were locked up. This cupboard was on the right side of the door of the judge's own room. Mary was still a baby in the cradle, and Fritz had only just begun to walk when the judge had that cupboard made by a very skillful carpenter who put such brilliant glass in the frames that the toys appeared 1,000 times finer when ranged on the shelves than when they were held in the hand. Upon the top shelf of all, which neither Fritz nor Mary could reach, the beautiful pieces of workmanship of Godfather Drosselmeyer were placed. Immediately beneath the shelf containing the picture books and the 2 lower shelves were given to Fritz and Mary, who filled them in the way they liked best. It seemed, however, to have been tactically agreed upon between the children that Fritz should hold possession of the higher shelf of the 2 for the marshallings of his troops, and that Mary should keep the lower shelf for her dolls and their households. I'm gonna be streaming a little longer, but there'll be the VOD, and I'm gonna have a playlist of all of my book readings on my VOD's channel, so be sure to follow. And if you're watching my VOD's channel right now, hi. This arrangement was entered into on the eve of Christmas Day. Fritz places soldiers upon his own shelf, and Mary, having thrust Miss Rose into a corner, gave the bedroom, formed by the lowest shelf, to Miss Clara, with whom she invited herself to pass the evening and enjoy the supper of sugar plums. Miss Clara, on casting her eyes around, saw that everything was in proper order. Her table was well spread with sugar plums and conserved fruits, and her nice white bed, with its white counterpane, of all so neat and comfortable. She therefore felt very satisfied with her new apartment. While these arrangements were being made, the evening wore away. Midnight was approaching. Godfather Drosselmeyer had been gone a long time, and yet the children could not be persuaded to quit the cupboard. Contrary to custom, it was Fritz that yielded first to the persuasion of his parents, who told him that it was time to go to bed. Well, he said, after all the exercise which my poor cavalry had today, they must be fatigued, and as those excellent soldiers all I know their duty towards me, and as so long as I remain here they will not close their eyes, I must retire. Those words, and having given them the watchword to prevent them from being surprised by a patrol of enemy, Fritz went off to bed. But this was not the case with Mary, and as her mamma, who was about to follow her husband to their bedchamber, desired her to tear herself away from the dearly beloved cupboard, little Mary said, "Only one moment, dear mamma, a single moment. Do let me finish all I have to do here. There are hundreds of or more important things to put to rights, and the moment I have settled them, I promise to go to bed." Mary requested this favor in so touching and plaintive tone. She was moreover so glad and obedient a child that her mother did not hesitate to grant her request. Nevertheless, as Miss Trudchen had already gone up the stairs to get Mary's bed ready, the judge's wife, thinking that her daughter might forget to put out the candles, performed that duty herself, leaving only the light and the lamp hanging from the ceiling. "Do not be long before you go to your room, my dear little Mary," said the judge's wife, "for if you remain up too long, you will not be able to rise at your usual hour tomorrow morning." With these words, the lady quitted the room and closed the door behind her. The moment Mary found herself alone, she bethought herself, above all things, and of her poor little Nutcracker, for she contrived to keep it in her arms, wrapped up in her pocket handkerchief. She placed him upon the table very gently, and rolled the handkerchief and examined his chin. The Nutcracker still seemed to suffer much pain and appeared very cross. "My dear little fellow," she said in a low tone, "do not be angry, I pray, because my brother Fritz hurt you so much. He had no evil intention, rest assured, only his manners have become rough. His heart is a little hardened by his soldier's life. Otherwise, he is a very good boy, I can assure you. I know that when you are better acquainted with him, you will forgive him. Besides, to atone for the injury which he has done to you, I will take care of you, which I will do so attentively that in a few days you will be quite all right. As for putting in the teeth again and fastening your chin properly, That is the business of Godpapa Drosselmeyer, who perfectly understands those things. Mary could not say more, for the moment she pronounced the name Godfather Drosselmeyer, the Nutcracker, to whom this discord was addressed, made a dreadful grimace. His eyes suddenly flashed so brightly that the little girl stopped short in affright and stepped back a pace, but as the Nutcracker immediately afterwards resumed its admirable expression and its melancholy smile, she fancied that it might have been the sport of an illusion, and that the flame of the lamp, agitated by the current air, had thus disfigured the little man. She even laughed at herself, saying, "I am indeed very foolish to think that this wooden puppet could make faces to me. Come, let me draw near the poor fellow and take care of him, which he requires." Having thus mused within herself, Mary took the puppet once more in her arms and drew near the cupboard, knocked at the glass door which Fritz had closed, and said to the new doll, "I beg of you, Miss Clara, to give up your bed to my poor Nutcracker, who is unwell, and to shift yourself to the sofa tonight. Remember that you are in excellent health yourself, as your round and rosy cheeks sufficiently prove. Moreover, as this night is soon past, the sofa is very comfortable. There will not be many dolls in Nuremberg as well lodged as yourself." Miss Clara, as you may well suppose, did not utter a word, but it struck Mary that she seemed very sulky and discontent. But Mary, whose conscience told her that she had treated Miss Clara in the most considerate manner, used no further ceremony with her. Drawing the bed towards her, placed the Nutcracker in it, covering him with the clothes up to the very chin. She thought that she knew nothing as of yet of the real disposition of Miss Clara, whom she had only seen for a few hours, but that, as Miss Clara had appeared to be in a very bad humour at losing her bed, some evil might happen in the poor invalid if he were left with such an insolent person. She therefore placed the bed with the Nutcracker in it upon the second shelf, close by the ridge where Fritz's cavalry were quartered. Then, having laid Miss Clara upon the sofa, she closed the cupboard and was about to rejoin Miss Trudgeon in the bedchamber, when all around the room the poor girl heard a variety of low scratching sounds, coming from behind the chair, the store, and the cupboard. The large clock which hung against the wall, which was surmounted by a large gilt owl instead of a cuckoo, as is usual with old German clocks, began the usual whirling sound which gives warning of striking, yet it did not strike. Mary glanced towards it, and saw that the immense gilt owl had dropped its wings in such a way that it covered the entire clock. The bird thus forward as far as it could, hideous cat-like head, with its round eyes and crooked beak. Then the whirling sound of the clock became louder and louder, gradually changed into the resemblance of a human voice, until it appeared as if these words issued from the beak of the owl: "Clocks, clocks, clocks, whirl, whirl, whirl," in a low tone. "The king of the mice has a sharp ear. Sing him his old song, strike, strike, clocks all, sound his last hour, for his fate is nigh at hand." And then dong, dong, dong. The clock struck 12 in a hollow and gloomy tone. Mary was very frightened. She began to shudder from head to foot. She was about to run away from the room when she beheld Godfather Drosselmeyer seated upon the clock instead of the owl, the two skirts of his coat having taken the place of the dropping wings of the birds. At this spectacle, Mary remained nailed as if to the spot with astonishment. She began to cry, saying, "What are you doing up there, Godpapa Drosselmeyer? Come down here, and don't frighten me like that. Naughty Grandpapa Drosselmeyer." But at these words there began a sharp whistling and furious kind of tittering all around. Then in a few moments Mary heard thousands of little feet treading behind the walls, and the next she saw thousands of little lights through the joints in the wainscot. When I say little lights, I'm wrong. I mean thousands of little eyes. Mary very full well perceived that there was an entire population of mice about to enter the room, and in fact, in the course of 5 minutes, thousands and thousands of mice made their appearance by the creases of the door and the joints of the floor, and began to gallop hither and thither, until at length they ranged themselves in order of battle, as Fritz was wont to draw upon his wooden soldiers. All this seemed very amusing to Mary, and as she did not feel towards the mice that absurd alarm which so many foolish children experience, she thought she should divert herself with the sight, when there suddenly rang through the room a whistling so sharp, so terrible, and so long that a cold shudder passed over her. At the same time, a plank was raised up by some power underneath, and the king of mice, with 7 heads, all wearing gold crowns, appeared at her very feet, in the midst of the mortar and the plaster that was broken upon, and with each of his 7 mouths began to whistle and scream horribly, while the body to which those 7 heads... belonged forced its way through the opening. The entire army advanced towards the king, speaking with their little mouths 3 times in chorus. Then the various regiments marched across the room, directing their course towards the cupboard, and surrounding Mary on all sides, so that she began to beat a retreat. I had already told you that Mary was not a timid child, but when she saw herself surrounded by crowds of mice, commanded by that monster with 7 heads, fear seized upon her, and her heart began to beat so violently, it seemed as if it would burst from her chest. Her blood appeared to freeze in her veins, her breath failed her, and half fainting, she retreated with trembling steps. At length, and the pieces of panes in the cupboard, broken by her elbow which knocked against it, fell upon the floor. She felt at the moment an acute pain in her left arm, but at the same time her heart grew lighter, for she no longer heard the squeaking which had much frightened her. Indeed, everything had become quiet around her. The mice had disappeared, and she thought, terrified by the noises of glass which was broken, that she ought to refuge in their holes. But almost immediately afterwards a strange noise commenced in the cupboards, and numerous little sharp voices exclaimed, "To arms! To arms! To arms!" At the same time, the music of the godfather Drosselmeyer's country house, which had been placed upon the top shelf of the cupboard, began to play, and on all sides she heard the words, "Quick, rise to arms! To arms!" Mary turned round. The cupboard was lighted up in a wondrous manner, and all was bustling within. All harlequins, the clowns, the punches, and the other puppets scampered about, while the dolls set to work to make lint and prepare bandages for the wounded. At length, the Nutcracker himself threw off all the clothes and jumped off the bed, crying, "Foolish troop of mice, return to your holes, or you must encounter me." But at that menace a loud whistling echoed the room, and Mary perceived that the mice had not returned to their holes, but that, frightened by the noise of broken glass, they sought refuge beneath the chairs at tables, whence they were now beginning to issue again. On his side, Nutcracker, far from being terrified by the whistling, seemed to gather fresh courage. "Despicable king of mice!" he exclaimed. "It is thou, then? Thou'st accept the death which I have so long offered you? Come on, and let this night decide between us, and you, my good friends, my companions, my brethren. If it is indeed true that we are united in bonds of affection, support me in this perilous contest. On, on, let those who loved me follow." Neither did a proclamation produce such an effect. Never did. 2 harlequins, a clown, 2 punches, and 3 other puppets cried out in a loud tone, "Yes, my lord, we are yours in life and death. We will conquer under your command or die with you." At these words, which proved that there was an echo to his speech in the heart of his friends, Nutcracker felt himself so excited that he drew his sword, and without calculating the dreadful height on which he stood, leapt from the second shelf. Mary, upon perceiving the dangerous leap, gave a piercing cry for Nutcracker, seemed on the point of being dashed to pieces, when Miss Clara, who was on the lower shelf, darted from the sofa and received him in her arms. "Ah, my dear little Clara," said Mary, clasping her hands together with emotion, How have I mistaken your disposition? But Miss Clara, thinking only of the present events, said to the Nutcracker, "What, my lord, wounded and suffering as you are, you're plunging headlong into new dangers? Content yourself with commanding the army and let others fight. Your courage is known, and you can do no good by giving fresh proof of it." As she spoke, Clara endeavored to restrain the gallant Nutcracker by holding him tight in her arms, but he began to struggle and kick in such a manner that Miss Clara was obliged to let him glide down. He slipped from her arms and fell on his knees at her feet in a most graceful manner, saying, "Princess, believe me, that although at a certain period you were unjust towards me, I shall always remember you, even in the midst of battle." Miss Clara stooped as low as possible, and by taking him by his little arm, compelled him to rise. Then taking off her waistband of glittering with spangles, she made a scarf of it, and sought to pass it over the shoulder of the young hero, but he, stepping back a few paces and bowing at the same time in acknowledgment of so great a favor, untied the little white ribbon which Mary had bound to his chin, and tied it round his waist, pressing it to his lips. Then, light as a bird, he leapt from the shelf on the floor, brandishing his saber all the time. Immediately did the squeakings and creakings of the mice begin over again, and the king of mice, if to reply to the challenge of the Nutcracker, issued from beneath the great table in the middle of the room, followed by the main body of his army. At the same time, the wings on the right and left began to appear from beneath the armchair, under which they had taken refuge. The next part of this is going to be called the battle. And I'm gonna hit stop streaming and then start streaming again so the VOD cuts off here.